morning, everybody. I think I have the honor to welcome Professor Diana LAURILLAND, who is a very well-known professor at the time at the Institute of Education in London, and we have the honor to have her with us. So, please. Thank you very much.
Oh, you've gone back.
Oh, sorry.
Leap ahead like that. Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to talk at this conference. And the first thing I want to do is to thank you for listening to me in English, because to listen to me in Greek would be a disaster. So I think it's best I stick to English. But I'm very aware that we have to be very grateful that you're prepared to listen to us in English when we speak. What's so important about this particular conference is that I think the work that we do in open and distance learning is really coming of age now. It's coming to the attention of so many people all over the world in a way that hasn't quite happened in the past. The digital age has taken quite a long time to reach widely in education. So I think this is a very exciting time for us, and that's why I want to talk about the process of professionalizing teaching in the digital age. I'm going to begin by thinking about our professional responsibilities, because as teachers in higher education, whichever aspect of higher education we're involved in, we have a responsibility to understand how our role changes as digital technologies become more available, more innovative, more widely ranging in how appropriate they are for what we do. And when we're thinking about technology, it's so easy to get carried away by what the technology can do that we sometimes don't pause long enough to say, what do we need it to do? What are we trying to do in education? And it's worth, I think, particularly thinking about the moral imperative of higher education. What are we here to do in higher education? So I'm going to spend a little time on that, because that's the context within which we have to think about how best to use technology. And one of the new inventions that causes me to stand back and think, why are we here? What are we really doing? Is that oh, sorry, is that in the way?
It's in your computer now.
Okay. Is the advent of the MOOC, the Massive Open Online Course, because that has had a big impact on higher education in a way that no other technology really has in all the 30 years that we've had these digital technologies. So I think it's very important for us to understand what that invention means for us as open and distance learning professionals. Thinking in particularly about the MOOC in terms of professional development, what this means for collaborative learning among professionals, and then finally coming back to that issue of achieving the aims and purposes of higher education through open and distance learning. So, what are the aims and purposes of higher education? Well, this is a very big question, and I have to go back to the time almost 20 years ago now. Oh, you can't see the screen, I don't think, but back in 1997, in the UK, we had a special government-funded national commission on the aims and purposes of higher education, on rethinking what higher education meant now that we'd got to the 90s. And I was privileged enough to be a member of that commission, and we spent 18 months looking at all aspects of higher education and published a report which did lead to a lot of changes. And one of the first things we had to do was to decide what were the aims and purposes of higher education. And these are the four that we came up with. And interestingly, they were the same four that had been defined 30 years previously in the Robbins report, which was what led to the big expansion of higher education in the 60s. So we spent a lot of time trying to rethink from the ground up what should the aims and purposes of higher education be, and came up with the exact same four. And they were to inspire and enable individuals to to develop their capabilities to the highest potentials throughout life. Knowledge, all about increasing knowledge for the benefit of the economy and society. So the first one is really about teaching. The second one is really about research. And then thirdly, why does the public pay for it? Because it serves the needs of the economy. So there is that very important instrumental evaluation of what higher education is for. But finally, the social, the cultural, to shape a democratic, civilized, and inclusive society. So that was a kind of the moral dimension, if you like. So we might ask now, and you can't see that just about, what do these aims mean in the context of the globally collected digital world our graduates are now working in? Because we are trying to train young people for whom the working environment they go into is very much dominated by the digital world. And it will continue to be throughout their working life, and it will change in all sorts of interesting ways that we cannot possibly predict. So we have to rethink, what do these aims and purposes mean now, 20 years on? There's been no revision of that. It's still stayed the same. The government still works the same ones. And plotting what's happening in other countries around the world, I don't see any fundamental change to what we think higher education is about, which is good. But we do have to think what the digital world now means for this. Okay, so one aspect of the moral imperative is how on earth are we going to meet the global demand for higher education? Here is one estimate. By 2025, the global demand for higher education will double from 100 million that it is now to 200 million per year, mostly from the emerging economies. That's an enormous number of people to be educated. How on earth, with our current model of higher education, are we going to meet that demand? In addition to that, there's the UNESCO Millennium Goals, which you may remember for universal primary education. Back in the year 2000, they said we would need 1.5 million teachers to achieve universal primary education by 2015. We are a long way off that still. And in 2015, that was the estimate they still had. At the same time as developing new goals for UNESCO, every child should complete not just primary, but 9 years of free basic education. And post-basic education needs to be expanded to meet the needs for knowledge and skills in every economy. So the post-2015 goals are getting even more pressurized for the need for more higher education. So we have to ask ourselves, fundamentally, all of us in higher education, how does higher education play a major role in shaping a democratic, civilized, and inclusive society? How are we going to do that? We have, and the bit you can't see down there at the bottom, is a 1 to 25 staff-student ratio. Broadly speaking, most universities, some have much higher student numbers, and they go up to 1 to 30 or 1 to 50 even. In the best places in the UK, it's somewhere around 1 to 10. And that means that for those kinds of numbers, we need 20 million people to be able to teach in higher education. Well, we're not going to do that. So we have to have a different kind of model for the way in which we educate the world. And becoming a digitally skilled professional for all of us, whether we're talking about our graduates or ourselves, is quite a complex process. We have to ask ourselves, what do our students need to know that we're pushing out into this digital world? What are the high-level skills of a professional in this context? And certainly being able to access resources on the internet, evaluating where they come from, building your own personal digital collection, creating an online presence, orchestrating virtual visits, collaborating online for discussion. Lots of different kinds of skills we need for this. And by the way, these slides will be available on the conference website, so please don't feel you have to scribble notes. I know it's difficult to do. Now, it's not just students, it's also, we have to ask ourselves, what do we need to know as professional academics? And it's all these same things. I'm assuming that the first two we don't have to focus on, because as academics we probably know quite a lot by now of how to access resources on the internet and how to evaluate the origins of those sources. Building our personal digital collection, probably again, most people have a very good library of online resources and papers and journal papers and so on in our various EndNote connections. But that's not everybody. It's for our research, probably we do, for our teaching to a certain extent, but our teaching resources, building that personal resource of what we do for our teaching is a much more difficult process because we don't have the tools to help us as we do for research. So all of these things are areas where we as professionals have to keep renewing our skills and helping others to do it and using that in our teaching to help our students. And I think it's fair to say that all academics now must teach using open and distance learning. This is not an option any longer. If we're going to meet that kind of demand, if we're going to make higher education available to people who are working very hard, working full-time, and working hours increase all the time anyway, so nobody has time to study. So we've got to make that study process very efficient, not just for our students, but for our graduates and for their future working life. So I think we really have to be persuading all of our colleagues in universities, not just the enthusiasts here in the room, but all of our colleagues must now embrace these techniques and capabilities of being able to work with open and distance learning. Now I come back to the issue of MOOCs. How do MOOCs assist our work as open distance learning professionals? And I'm sure that when they first came on the horizon, many of us in this field would have been saying, we've been doing that for the past 20 years. We've been doing open and distance learning. We know how to do this on a large scale. We know how to do things wholly online. Nonetheless, MOOCs have made a big change, and we have to understand some of the nature and impact of some of those changes. And the first question I want to ask about this, again, kind of coming from the moral dimension, is if MOOCs are a solution, what is the problem they're a solution to? And there have been many arguments about how this is going to revolutionize higher education and at last higher education is going to be available to the world. But when we look at who is registering for MOOC courses, the Coursera average shows us, just taking Coursera as one example, that 85% of the participants in MOOCs already have degrees. That's just those registering. And then understanding the nature of the drop-off in completion of these massive open online courses. We have to understand that the people most likely to be in there at the end are not the undergraduate population. So all those people in those other categories who are still at school, still at post-secondary, the ones who might be about to enter higher education, the ones who are currently in higher education, far lower numbers are entering MOOCs. So it's not really a problem, a solution to the problem of undergraduate education. What the problem it's solving is how to provide free education for highly qualified professionals. And I don't think that's a problem that we ever thought we had in higher education. I don't think any government would have been pleased for us to come up and say, we have the solution to providing free education for highly qualified professionals. That's not anybody's problem. Highly qualified professionals can afford to pay for their own education. Now, unfortunately, the big universities, Stanford, Harvard, Edinburgh, MIT, have all launched into this, happily offering to the world free education for highly qualified professionals, and they've led the way, and all the other universities in the world have followed. So we have a big problem already in understanding how we're ever going to pull that back to saying, actually, we need to get these people to pay in order that we find that way of educating the world who really need it. Those 200 million who are coming 10 years hence, probably all there now, already there now actually, who need this to be much, much cheaper than it currently is. So instead of looking at MOOCs as a way of providing undergraduate education, I want to look at them as a way of providing professional education as a route to solving the problem of undergraduate education and that demand. So we tried working with Coursera and launched a couple of years ago a MOOC on ICT in primary education, because there was a clear demand for that. In primary schools, there's lots of teachers using ICT, embellishing and enhancing their work with what they can do for their learners. So we wanted to capture their expertise and enable them to share it by running a course that was entirely for teachers. So the great majority of the people that we got on the course were classroom teachers. There were also head teachers and also education policy makers. There were a few people coming in from higher education and from research, but by and large they were teachers. So this was a very niche course. It was, first of all, it was for just people in education, and then it was for primary school teachers, and then it was for primary school teachers interested in ICT. So it was a very niche course. And yet it still attracted 9,000 people from across the world, 174 countries. It's fantastic range for what we can do now. So that alone is impressive. We have to be able to use that. And we looked at the relationship between what was the Coursera average for people with degrees already, and our course had not 85% but 89%. So not very much difference. We were aiming for professionals. We got practically the same proportion. So we can conclude then that this is a pretty good medium for reaching professionals, for continuing professional development, but not for undergraduate education. If we look at where those people were coming from, the Coursera average shows 37% of the people on the MOOCs are from the emerging markets. Now remember, that's where the big demand for higher education is coming from. So that's not bad. They're getting 37% of the people coming in are coming from those places. On our course, it was 44%, and when we ran it again this year, it was 49%. So we're increasing gradually the reach to the places that really need it, and that's extremely important if we're going to tackle this problem. So what is collaborative learning like in this context for professionals? And I want to just go through this as a case study illustrating what we can hope to do. It is a good pedagogy for professional development, because when we think about how we run a staff development course, or we bring people into universities to tell them how they should be doing whatever their professional task is, we tend to use things like lectures and videos and resources. We're updating them on the latest research or the latest practice in the professional area. So that heavy duty emphasis on this is how we need to be thinking in this field now, that's entirely appropriate for professionals. They want that kind of updating, a window on their effective practice. Secondly, we use a lot of discussion in the professional group, and that's because they're knowledgeable people, they've got a lot of experience, they've got a lot of expertise of their own, so they are able to exchange ideas about what we're talking about, and they can help us relate that current thinking to their own everyday practice and to the context-related issues that they come up with. So, for example, in the ICT for Primary Teachers MOOC, we were saying, here's a wonderful way of using iPads or tablets or online access to resources. And in the forums, we would say, now how would this relate to your own context? And there, of course, they say, well, in our context, we've got no hope of being able to get access to tablets. All right, so we look at the solution to that in that context. Or we can only get intermittent access and we've got very poor access to broadband. So what are the solutions for that kind of context? So the professional input adjusts itself to the context that we're learning about from the professionals on the course. So it's very much a two-way process, very much a dialogic process. And with the capability of discussion forums and things of that kind, it is possible to do that. So collaboration is a very important aspect of professional development, and I've grayed that out slightly because none of the MOOC platforms that we currently have are good for collaborative learning. They're good for discussion learning, they're good for presentation, but they don't help you work together to produce something together. So always, when we're running these MOOCs, we have to go outside the platform and get people collaborating and sharing ideas somewhere else as well. And I'll show you an example of that. But notice that there is no small group tutorials, no personalized guidance, no individualized tutor feedback, no authenticated assessment. None of that happens on MOOCs. So we have not yet managed to achieve the economies of scale for any of these activities. And all of this is what's essential for undergraduate education. Undergraduates are novices in their field. They've rarely learned enough about how to learn, about how to become independent learners, about self-regulation. So they have to be nurtured, scaffolded. And that's what we do in higher education. We help them become the people they really want to become. It's that first personal imperative of higher education, as I mentioned right at the start, enabling every individual to achieve their potential. That's what we have to do. MOOCs can't do that. It can work for professionals who know how to learn, but not for the novice learner. So, it's good for CPD. And one example of that is being able to bring professionals up to date on the latest ideas. And this is an example from a MOOC that we're running currently as we speak on blended learning, which we've just started last week. And I'll give you a link to that in case you're interested. It's running on the FutureLearn platform. And it's for teachers in vocational education areas where there is very little use of good quality blended learning. Where there is good use of it, we've been able to capture this on video and show examples of how teachers in the vocational education area are making use of digital technologies. So this is a great way of being able to present the new approaches and the new methods going on in the field to give other professionals a window on what's possible in their field. And at the same time, we can make dynamic links to other resources and tools, so you go outside the FutureLearn platform to say, look at all these great YouTube videos, or here's a design tool which you can use to help you, support you in your process. So that's the updating of the professionals part of it. But there's also professionals sharing their ideas and experience, and here's one example of how we've done that on the platform. Having watched the video case studies, we now direct the discussion, which is in these platforms, to looking at how you enrich the classroom experience to bring in more kinds of activity, looking at how you make use of existing digital resources and so on. So we're directing the discussion, which runs, just sort of scrolls alongside this main part here, so that when you come into the platform, and maybe you're a week late into this conversation, there's been 500 comments already. Okay, well those are gone. You know, you've missed that part of the conversation, you're joining this part of the conversation. So one of the things we're trying to get people to think about is don't worry about the conversation you've missed. It's like coming a day late to a conference. You don't try to catch up on all of those conversations you didn't have. Enjoy the conversations you're having now. So this is what's going on. You know, this is the current conversation. And that's a great way of enabling people to share their responses to the sort of thing that we're showing in the videos. So that ongoing conversation about the techniques and issues and how they relate to the reality of professional practice. Because again, in the vocational education area, it's often one of those areas which gets least funding after schools, after universities. It's very tough for people in that field. And then professionals sharing ideas for innovating on the Coursera course for primary school teachers, for example. This is a conversation about the fact that on the course we advised them to run a blog. So they kept a running commentary on what they were learning. And they've picked up that idea in this conversation, saying, we've been encouraged to create a blog on this course so we could keep track, but we could, all of us, use it with the kids, to ask them to create a blog to register the study and so on. The next person carries on, it's a wonderful ongoing project. Students can work through the editing process and styles of writing before posting, and then discusses that further. This person down here, I totally agree. Teachers should encourage to create blogs as a means of allowing students to express themselves freely. and so on. So all of these teachers are discussing among themselves what more they could do with the ideas that we're offering. So we learned an awful lot from this process because they were sharing so much with us. So that's the kind of conversation that could go on. But you do have to direct it. You have to focus the conversation and say, what are we going to be discussing today? Here's another way of getting them to collaborate, because, as I said, there are no collaboration tools as such on the platform. So we went to the Padlet wall. I don't know how many people of you know if you've come across Padlet, but it's just a great, simple technology. It's a pinboard where everybody pins their ideas. All you have to do is click on this sort of fake cork board, and you double click on that, and then you fill in. In this case, we were asking people to find resources or tell us about resources on computational thinking. Very important in primary school now. Many schools are introducing children to the idea of computational thinking. If you know of Scratch technology, very nice, simple kind of programming tool, very high level, which begins to get learners thinking about how you give instructions to a computer to do something. So some of the ideas are around that, and you just double click, you put in this case, they were putting in their name, and then a little title of what the particular site was about. And then they put in the link to the picture or to the site, and you have this nice visual display. So many of these people have never done such a thing in their lives before. Very simple to be able to share the ideas that way. And that then they could take back to the context of the forum and discuss, what we asked them to discuss, what other ideas they found that could be of use to them. So that's another kind of example for how you can actually get collaboration going, sharing ideas. So how well did it all work? Well, we did some analysis. We had pre and post surveys, but we also looked at what was happening during the course itself. And one of the great things about MOOC platforms is they collect a lot of what we now call learning analytics. So all of this data was there. So we were able to look, for example, at what was happening in week 6 of the course, just as all the other MOOCs in the University of London, which had run the previous year, 4 of them, the first 4 results there are from those other MOOCs. One of which was in history, one was in law, one was in malicious software and things like that, computer science and so on. So we knew what their data was. Of those people active in week 6, somewhere around 60% of them were watching videos still. So that was the main event going on in week 6. What we were interested in was not just whether they were watching videos, but also whether they were active in forums. So we looked at that as well, and look at the difference between our cohort. Can you see the green bar at the side? It was almost 40% of the people active in week 6 were posting in forums. For all the other MOOCs, it was somewhere around 2%. So for this kind of cohort, it's a very different kind of experience. The other MOOCs, most MOOCs, are for everybody, anybody and everybody. So you have a complete mix of people there. We were doing 2 things differently. We were having a very specific cohort of like-minded people, if you like. There were people interested in the use of technology in primary education, so a particular group of professionals. And we were offering a study guide, which said, we've shown you this video or this Padlet wall, now talk about this topic. So it wasn't just people piling in with any old chat. And that, I think, was one of the things that made the difference. Those forums were really valuable to people. And we had a much higher percentage, you can't quite see that down there, but that's nearly 30% were still active at the end of the MOOC, which is a very high ratio for MOOCs, which you normally get about 5%. And how good was it? Everyone asks about this. For the average for the other MOOCs run by the University of London, they got mostly very good, with a lot of excellence and good. So it was a very popular. They were very popular MOOCs. For ours, we did better, I think, again, because we had a very specific cohort. So the results were much better because it was tailored to what those people needed. So it is feasible to achieve the expectations that professionals. What about collaboration activities? I've talked about the importance of collaboration, and I think collaboration is so important to us because this is very difficult. We can't expect to do everything on our own. So being able to get teachers collaborating with each other is extremely important. We built a lot of that in. So we were asking here, after the course ran, about which activities do you rate, and gave them a 1 to 5 scale, from really valuable to not so valuable. And it had all sorts of things in there in addition to these. So these were the top rated ones. All of them getting above 75%. But it's interesting, look at that top one. Doing a peer review. So this, of course, is vital in the context of large-scale online distance learning, because the teacher is working with thousands of students in the context of a massive course like this. Even when we're running Open University style courses, there are lots of students out there. So having to do all of that review of how good the students' work is very difficult. Peer review becomes important because you learn a lot by reviewing someone else's work. You've just submitted your assignment, now you're evaluating someone else's assignment, and that tells you more about your own. So it's a good pedagogy. And for professionals it's especially good because you can trust something that you get back from the others. They are also professionals. Nonetheless, it was doing a peer review which got the top rating, even above the course videos. Receiving a peer review, not quite so valuable, because none of us like peer review, and there were lots of comments saying, but they didn't understand what I was saying, they didn't read it properly, and who are they to comment on me? And we just said, welcome to the world of peer review. That's what it's like. So we were perfectly happy with that. And of course, once you've done that peer review of somebody else, then you've done a lot of learning already. So that was very encouraging, that we can, at least among professionals, use that form of assessment. And then the collaboration activities were things like the community of participants, the discussion forums, the learning designer tool, which I'm going to talk a lot more about in the seminar, which follows later on, and the Padlet wall, which I've shown you an example of, and Digo, which is a site where you share bibliographic resources and you tag them, and then you can build up a kind of collective library. So all of those are ways in which that community of people are being brought together to help each other. Collaboration is critical. And all of those got these high ratings of above 75% approval on that sort of 1 to 5 scale. And how well did they learn? Well, again, we compared this before they'd taken the course, so that was what they rated their understanding to be before, and after there was a very considerable increase in their understanding of the subject matter. And that, of course, is what we should always expect in any course that we're doing, and especially in a staff development course. But on a massive scale, it's very encouraging to know that that sort of thing is possible. The pedagogy, this CPD pedagogy, achieves value for CPD participants. So let's come back in the closing stages now to the moral contribution that MOOCs can make. And I'm going to go back to that initial idea of being able to get collaborative knowledge development by professionals on the large scale. It's important to remember we still don't have a business model that makes any sense. It's still free education for the best educator. And we have to understand, therefore, where our moral contribution comes. And there is a report, I put in a link to the evaluation report on that particular MOOC that I've been talking about. So that will be available in the slides when you get it. But coming back then to where does higher education stand in this huge demand across the world, let's just think about this one example. Where are we going to find 1.5 million teachers by this year? Not much of it left. Well, we're not going to do it this year, but let's think about how MOOCs could actually help us towards that. I've just shown you how that course, which had an 8-teacher global team from 8 different countries around the world, we all took about a week each. It was funded by UNESCO, based on some work that the 8 of us had done together previously on the use of ICT in primary schools. Now, we were able to reach between us over 8,000 people. So I call it a 1,000 to 1 ratio. That's a good ratio for managing this very large scale. But of course we're not reaching the learners, we're reaching the teachers. So how is that going to help? Well, we were running a 6-week MOOC, that's not very much, but maybe you have a whole collection of those. Maybe that's enough to help 8,000 national teachers, each of those support 25 regional teachers in their countries. So now we're getting down to the level of local towns, local cities in those emerging economies, and how are they going to use what they've learned to get to the village support groups, the local adults who are doing their best to give their children education, in the remote areas, in the urban slums, in the townships, where that's what adults do. They do their best to provide some kind of education together. And in some places that we've been working with in Central Africa, for example, it's not the state that provides in the context of an urban slum, it's the local adults. So suppose we could get this to work in such a way that those local training courses, which get to the regional teachers in all of those different areas in the emerging economies, each of those only has to work with 8 people in order to get that 1,600,000 people across the world supporting children in primary education. And maybe eventually we could get those into being qualified teachers, so that we eventually get. Now, that's a long way off. That's a lot of difficult things to do. But the arithmetic tells us that with online, open distance learning, we could get there. We could get somewhere near there if we only had the will and the imagination to see how we might begin that process with what we've got already. And looking at who we got to in our own course, we got to 1,300 teachers from the in-focus countries which are defined by our Department for International Development as the hardest to reach in the world. They have a list of 28, 29 countries where achievement at primary level is the worst. Those are the ones they're focused on trying to support. We had 1,300 teachers registering from those countries. So we can reach even the hardest to reach. And they do have, to some degree, broadband access. They do have smartphones increasingly available in those places. It begins to look as though it could be possible. So bridging the digital skills gap for digital professionals, very hard to do. Who are they all? In our own country, in the UK, we are working very hard through this course to support the teachers in vocational education who are nowhere near themselves being able to do this after 20 years of having access to the technology. So this is not easy. And for that sector of education, it's become extremely hard for them to afford to be able to do this. So do join us there if you have a chance. If you use that tweet, you'll get through to it. And again, the slides will give you the link. So let me finally round off by saying, I think it's possible for MOOCs to help us achieve the aims and purposes of higher education through open and distance learning. Because that fixed cost for production and curation and assembly of those kinds of resources which are available can be distributed over very large numbers of professionals. So that's cheap as a way of providing education. The difficult part is the variable costs, because every learner on that course needs help. But if you have a knowledgeable peer group who support and collaborate with each other, then we get over that kind of problem. Then we can make those kinds of support costs very low. We need to be working with those participants who can afford to pay, and we have to do something about the fact that they've run away with this now, and they're making it free to all those people. We have to try and retrieve that. I think it does have high impact on the professional users of those research findings and outputs, especially if they can cascade, and we can support them in cascading to others. And also we mustn't forget the fact that when we bring academics into doing this, and at UCL we've just brought some 80 people into, 80 academics who never thought about online learning before. We said, here's some money to develop a MOOC. What would you like to do? 80 people said, me, and wanted to get into that straight away. So it can work to bring in people in, and then they transfer it to their undergraduates. So that's the hope, and that's how I think we can help our colleagues in this task of achieving that moral imperative that higher education has to bring higher education to the world. Thank you.